Greetings, this is Logue Elder, and this is another installment of Let's Talk Consciousness. So, I think this is now the third video where I'm still more or less on the same topic because it is a rabbit hole that has really piqued my curiosity and a lot of other feelings as well. I should say curiosity is probably the least of it, but um, a kind of empty void or space where you're trying to understand something that like this is something really significant happens and you're trying to understand all these angles. Um, but to not jump ahead too far, just to quickly get a mission statement out there because every video will probably start with this. Um, I am setting out to make relatively short videos that are discussions of practical day-to-day aspects of life through the lens that what we experience, either on one hand is a manifestation of consciousness, that reality itself is a kind of dream or simulation or however you want to think of it, or on the other hand, in a more practical sense, that we are dealing with the world through our conscious perception and we all ought to work on making it better. And by making it better, I mean learning to forgive ourselves and others and to love unconditionally, for the sake of the quality of our consciousness and our effect on the world around us. So with that being, the brief mission statement, when it comes to a big conflict, those are the kinds of things that I want to go into is what do you do with conflict, and what do you do if your assumption is that you ought to be moving in the direction of loving everybody, and yet there's all these things that are kind of set against you in that way, ways that we kind of are trained in a sense to be kind of unloving and to be very judgmental and trying to break out of those things. So since the Charlottesville protest attack, a person driving their car through a counter protest to you know alt-right white supremacist protest, and the people who oppose them being attacked with a car, that obviously I'm sure you're familiar, but that's the thing that as I've been reacting to it, and my general take on things is, as I've said, is through this push towards unconditional love. It means, you know, dealing with these disagreements the way that you have to, but refusing to become hateful, and obviously that has to inform how far you're willing to take it, because if you're willing to take it to violence, then it kind of begs all sorts of questions of, can you do that while you're loving somebody? But what I mean is, refusing to see the people who you oppose on a certain issue as fundamentally other or subhuman or worthy of some kind of terrible fate. And that's not fucking easy. And there's all sorts of built-in traps with some of the more complicated problems that we have, because I mean, the most direct one being that we suck at communicating with each other. I mean, we only have one real way of communicating to each other, so what do we have to judge it against? But if just to take a moment to step back from our situation and think of it another way, I'm sure lots of people are familiar with Terence McKenna, but quite a few aren't. He expressed the idea that we ought to have, I'm paraphrasing, but we ought to have some level of skepticism or agnosticism at how good we are at interpreting other people. And he says that because, we rely on words that upon hearing, somebody else immediately calls up a mental definition out of a dictionary in their mind, and it's the hope among two or more people who are talking that they have the same definition for a given word, or that combination of words derives the same meaning. And often it doesn't, and it means that communicating among people is really difficult. And he's using as a basis of comparison the idea that if you could literally transmit your thoughts and experiences to another person, that would be this kind of optimal communication. And what we have in place of that is, a very impoverished form of exchanging ideas. And so obviously we're not psychic, and we can't really, just beam our thoughts into somebody else. So, there you have it. But so just the beginning assumption that any conversation that happens about these things is fraught with the problem of differing definitions of words and interpretations of intentions and meaning. And that's a really tough one, because I think we tend to jump to all sorts of conclusions when we hear someone speak really quickly about what their intentions are. And it's really hard to get away from that, because I think we need to do that. I think we have to make a lot of snap judgments about what a person is all about, and, trying to give them a thumbs up or thumbs down, within the first few seconds of them talking. And that's not very effective if you're trying to communicate, but it is something that I think we tend to do anyway. So for me, my direct experience with that recently, and before I get into that, having a conversation, because I find myself just really delving into, as I said, rabbit hole of far left and far right, and trying to hear different people not only express their point of view, you could say, to a camera, by themselves, meaning not in a dialogue, having people kind of, recording themselves like me, talking about it, or talking, being interviewed, and then actually people talking to each other about it, from these two different sides. And it's hard to watch, because it's like people get so upset, and obviously, it's a serious issue, and it's like the height of conflict for us in a civilized society, where we otherwise expect to have, well, even as I start that sentence, I realize it's problematic, but meaning people who are not entrenched in these things, which there are a lot of people who are, they're entrenched in racism because it's a part of their day-to-day life, or they're entrenched in sexism, or some sort of gender bigotry, or whatever it may be. Bigotry is like pushing down on them day to day. Like, that's a serious situation, and that it's not a common experience for most people who are viewing it externally, if you want to think of it that way. And admittedly, I'm not in the midst of that struggle, so I have to put my own thoughts and feelings in a kind of certain clause or box, or whatever you want to say, that I'm not going through those experiences, so I'm not trying to necessarily step in front of people who are, and like offer an opinion, and I'm not trying to necessarily suggest people should see things the way I do. I'm just saying it's people all over the place should be sharing, because there's all sorts of opportunity for learning. And I would hope that people would be gentle with each other, but that's just, that's where we're at. We're going to be kind of playing bumper cars, or worse, in certain dialogues. But that being said, being outside of that particular struggle, but having feelings about it, like I should say, I mean, I grew up in a time and place where I saw racism, sexism, homophobia. I mean, being born in '84 and being a certain age when I, became familiar with like the Matthew Shepard case, one of the biggest high-profile hate crimes against a gay teenager that was, brutally murdered for being gay. In that epoch of my life, I mean, there's other cases, and it's not standalone, but my point is, that was one that like really flung into the forefront of conversation in the 90s. And I felt like I had a stake in that, even though I'm basically living pretty comfortably being straight, because nobody's pushing down on me to be a different way, and I'm not experiencing that firsthand. And yet I still had a feeling of really wanting justice for not only Matthew Shepard, but everybody else who found themselves in a similar kind of situation. I felt outraged, and I felt like justice needed to be done, for just an exorbitant number of people who are in the same situation, who are not reported on, like, his case was. And even, I don't want to say lesser forms of it, but maybe forms that don't involve violence, but people being, young kids being made homeless because they're gay, or you know, are transgender, or you know, any number of things, but um, people whose lives are deeply, deeply changed because they present the side of themselves that they had to hide up into a, you know, to a point. Um, to me, I identified with that, even not being in that category, just because, just I mean, nothing more complicated than just human compassion. I mean, so the reason I'm belaboring this point is that there's a flip side to that, which is if you are not careful with how you present yourself and your point of view, or if your point of view is nuanced, or admittedly in my case, not being an oppressed group, if I'm not careful with how I present myself, somebody may, in that kind of quick way that we make snap judgments, you know, think that I'm either racist, sexist, homophobic, you know, any number of things, if I'm not communicating really effectively, you know, if I'm not choosing the perfect words, or you know, the difference in meaning is interpreted in, you know, another way. So it's very problematic to have those conversations sometimes. And, you know, so I found myself in one of those conversations where I was being accused of being racist, and on a kind of side tangent, accused of being cop loving, which, it's like, I don't even want to open that fucking can of worms, but like, honestly, you know, being a teenager, being opposed to all sorts of political institutions, you know, religious, social, I mean, just really wanting to see a lot of it just burn down in some way or another, you know, being an angry teenager. I took particular umbrage at being accused of being cop loving. The punk rocker in me was like, you motherfucker, how dare you? But, um, you know, at the same time, my point of view is that I don't view cops as inherently bad. I view them as a category of people who are in a particularly fucked up system, and that role in some ways should not even exist. But you know, that's another conversation for, you know, if you're interested in arguments of anarchism, which I'm not necessarily taking on any titles, but at least I do like having those conversations. But my point is, you know, I really, really don't want to be misidentified as somebody who's, you know, a bigot or hateful, and I know I'm not that thing, so it doesn't really resonate with me. And I didn't get like upset, like angry. I mean, I'm joking. I say you motherfucker, you know, and how dare you and all that. But it's like that's a passing thing. But like my lasting feeling is like I know where I stand and I know where my compassions lie. But sometimes the conversation gets to be so black and white that, like, you know, so polarized that you cannot waver at all to seem as if you're not fully on this side, or else you are just immediately flipped to the opposite side. And that's the thing I'm saying. I reject that premise altogether. I think it is possible to view things from multitudes of angles, and to suspend your disbelief. And I think people worry that that inherently means you're pro whatever that thing is, and I just couldn't disagree more. I think that we all have the ability to put on the VR helmet of looking at somebody else's point of view and trying to see, you know, see some, granted, it's a dim comparison to the real thing. Experiential knowledge, you know, you just can't transmit it. Um, but that being said, I think that we can do all sorts of things to put ourselves in other people's shoes when we really try. And I think a lot of us don't want to try. It's revolting or intimidating or whatever the thing may be, or we're in too much pain. You know, actually, I should say the flip side of it is that for some of these things, to talk about them at all from this kind of outsider perspective, the people in the midst of it it's such an open wound that you really, you know, it's just you can't be heard in that environment, or maybe ought not to be speaking in that environment. I mean, that's a difficult thing to pin down. But I would just hope that there's always room for compassion on whatever side you find yourself on, that you find yourself opposed to somebody, that love prevails. I mean, I know it's cliche and cheesy, and it doesn't make for a strong position. It's a nuanced, very hard to defend position, and it always seems to evoke outrage. But I'm not deterred. I'm still gonna voice that point of view that I think we all ought to be moving towards unconditional love and forgiveness, and it takes us in all sorts of weird places, and it's difficult